Now that you have done the initial literature review and came up with your own hypothesis to test, let's talk about the methods we can employ to test your hypothesis. In general, there are two overall types of analytical methods you can employ when conducting social science research: quantitative and qualitative methods. I say that these are two overall types when conducting social science research because this is true not only for political science, but for economics, sociology, psychology, and so forth. In general, quantitative analysis allows a researcher to examine correlation between variables to see which independent variable or variables contribute to a statistically significant change in the dependent variable. And when for qualitative analysis, there are various other methods, but for the purpose of this course, we will cover the two fundamental methods of qualitative comparative analysis: Mill's method of agreement, or most different system of design, or Mill's method of difference, or most similar systems design. Quantitative and qualitative methods are sometimes called case-oriented versus variable-oriented comparison strategies. The differences are that in quantitative methods, one is interested in finding out which variable or variables have the most significant impact or statistically significant correlation on the dependent variable, whereas the qualitative methods, the analysis is often focused on examining a single or a few cases in detail in order to identify the causality between the independent variable and the dependent variable. Each of these comparison strategies come with its own set of strengths and weaknesses. A case-oriented comparison strategy, for example, is very strong on internal validity. In other words, you are able to pinpoint the cause of phenomenon you are interested in. However, it is weak on external validity, which means your findings might only be valid for the case or cases you examined, but does not apply to any other cases. On the other hand, variable-oriented comparison strategy provides you the ability to generalize, which means it is strong on external validity. For example, 42% of the time, event A happens when factor B is present. But you don't really know why there is a correlation between the presence of factor B and the occurrence of event A. Yes, you could theorize why this might be, but you don't really know, because that is not what the variable-oriented research is designed to do. This chart shows us graphically the strengths and weaknesses of variable-oriented and case-oriented comparison strategies. You can see clearly that case-oriented comparison compares fewer cases and has lower level of abstraction, which means the research results are not easily generalizable. Variable-oriented comparison, on the other hand, as you can see here on the upper right-hand corner, compares a larger amount of cases and is able to provide you a higher level of abstraction. So which comparison strategy is right for you? Well, it depends. Sometimes the research you are doing naturally lends itself to one or the other. Other times, it is based on the preference of the researcher. Some people are just better at case-oriented research than at variable-oriented research. So for your paper, which method you choose is truly up to you. No matter which methods you decide to employ, there are some basic rules that everyone has to adhere to. You must have clearly in your head and in writing a well-defined dependent and independent variables that are able to be measured and tested. Secondly, your definitions and measurements must be defined as precisely as possible and need to be backed up with either some relevant literature or theory. Finally, you need to be able to specify the predicted relationship between your dependent variable and independent variables. In other words, you should have some sort of idea whether your independent variable will have a positive or a negative impact on the dependent variable based on the readings and theories you are employing. At this point, some of you may be wondering where you can get a list of dependent and independent variables. Well, you actually already have them. They come from your hypothesis that you have proposed. Let's look at an example. So for our example, the author has provided 3 hypotheses that he wants to test. Here's hypothesis 1.
hypothesis 2, and hypothesis 3. We can see that from these hypotheses, the dependent variable is the level of political repression. The author conceptualizes the term first and further defines what political repression is. Finally, the author proposes how to measure political repression. Notice that the measurement and his definitions are all based on the literature. Also, the author brings in his independent variable, level of democracy, length of democratic rule, and social homogeneity, all from his hypotheses. Level of democracy came from hypothesis 1. Hypothesis 2 brings us the duration of democratic rule. Hypothesis 3 gives us social homogeneity within a state or societal fracturization. As with the dependent variable, the author goes through and conceptualizes each independent variable and tells us how he is going to measure it. So, from this example, as you can see that independent variables and dependent variables are not something that you just get out of literature review, but it is actually something that comes out of your hypothesis. So when we say that it is extremely important that you write your hypothesis in a clear and concise manner, and in a manner that you can measure and define all the terms, this is what we mean.
For the purpose of this course, we will touch on two basic qualitative methods. First is Mill's method of agreement, or most different systems design. Second is Mill's method of difference, or most similar systems design. Now let's talk about how you would utilize each method. First, we are going to discuss Mill's method of agreement, or most different systems design. A simple way to remember this method is to imagine that you are looking for similarities in the vast sea of differences. In other words, you're looking for the two rubber duckies that are facing the same direction. So when would you use the most different systems design to conduct your analysis? This method is used when you have no variance in the dependent variable. For this example, we have a research question, why do social revolutions occur, and a hypothesis that is proposed by the author. Let's take a look at the example depicted on this table about why social revolutions happen. As you can see, we are comparing three states, France, Russia, and China. You can see that there is no variance in our dependent variable as denoted with yes under each dependent variable column. As you look at the four independent variables that are depicted on this table, you notice that only one of the four independent variables is similar. From this, one may conclude that external military threat was the variable that gave rise to social revolutions in these three states. So remember, the most different systems design should be used when there is no variance in the dependent variable, and the comparison cases should be as far different in their characteristics as possible. And you are looking for that one or two characteristics among these cases that happen to be similar. Now let's take a look at Mill's method of difference, or most similar systems design. Again, a simple way to remember this method is to imagine that you are looking for the yellow rubber ducky that happens to be different in the vast sea of similarities. So which yellow ducky is not looking in the right direction? That's what you're looking for. So when would you use most similar systems design? This method is used when you have a very similar cases, but you have varying outcomes or for your dependent variable. For this example, the research question is why do civil wars occur, and the author has a hypothesis that he is trying to test. Let's take a look at this example as depicted on the table on why civil war happens. As you can see, we are again comparing three states, Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Cuba, to determine why civil wars occur. You can see that there is a variance in our dependent variable. As you look at the dependent variable, Costa Rica is the only state that has not had a civil war. As you look at the four independent variables that are depicted on this table, you notice that only one of the four independent variables do not agree across all three states. All three states had poverty issues, all three states had a colonial past, and none of the states had external threat. However, if you look at the income inequality variable, you notice that Costa Rica had a moderate income inequality, as El Salvador and Cuba had high income inequality. From this, one may conclude that there is a relationship between high income inequality or moderate income inequality, or high income inequality in this case, and civil war. So remember, the most similar systems design, you are looking for what is different in the independent variables that causes your dependent variable to have variance. While in the most different systems design, you are looking for what is the same in the independent variable that causes your dependent variable to have no variance. Next, let's take a look at quantitative methods. Although quantitative methods are most often associated with statistical analysis, for this course, you do not have to know how to conduct statistical analysis in order to use quantitative methods for your paper. If you know how to conduct statistical analysis, you are welcome to do so for the paper. However, that is not a requirement. Now let's look at how we can employ quantitative method to conduct analysis for this course's research paper. As we discussed earlier, you do not have to know how to use statistical analysis packages to employ quantitative methods for this class. In this example, we are going to show you how you can do this without using statistical analysis packages. For the example, we are going to test the hypothesis that a state's income is positively correlated with a level of democracy in that state. Conceptually, you can think about this in a 2x2 table shown on the left, or if you would like a bit more granularity, you can conceptualize this in a 3x2 table as shown on the right. If our hypothesis is correct, then we should expect that most of the states to fall into either the upper left-hand box or the lower right-hand box of the table on the left, with much smaller number of states located in the remaining two boxes. If we are using the table on the right, we should expect the states to be distributed most in the upper left-hand box, lower right-hand box, and somewhat equally distributed between the two middle boxes, with the remaining two boxes remaining mostly empty.
To test our hypothesis, we now turn to gathering our data. For this example, we are going to use Polity 4 data as a measurement of our democracy, and World Bank GDP data to measure our state income. Once you get to these two pages, you can download all these data into an Excel spreadsheet. Once you have done so, your Excel spreadsheet for Polity 4 data looks something like this. It has years from 1800 all the way to 2012 by each country. And what you're looking for is this column here that says Polity 2. Polity 2 is an index score of how democratic a state may be. Your other data set comes from the World Bank. World Bank also has a GDP data that you can download as an Excel file, and it looks something like this. It lists all the countries down the side. It has data from 1960 all the way up to 2012, as you see here on this column. For our purposes, what we're interested in is the GDP for 2012 for each country and the Polity 2 score for each country that measures their level of democracy. As we have set up the 2x2 or 3x2 table earlier, the the states that go into each of those boxes come from what we will fill in here in this Excel spreadsheet. What I have done is I have cut the data set for polity 2 into just 2012 and sorted them alphabetically by each country. And I got rid of all the other variables except for the polity 2 score. What I also have here is a GDP for only 2012, and I got rid of all the other years because we will not be using them for this example. And I'll have also sorted the country down the side. What I'll do now is I will simply copy and paste the countries over from one or the other data set, does not really matter. And you copy the corresponding polity 2 score. Just so that I know I'm copying the right ones. Do this. Argentina is empty. I'll leave it empty. And let's do some more. Just 3 more. Azerbaijan. Bahrain. And Bangladesh. And that's enough for now. As you can see, what we have here is 11 states with polity 2 scores, with Afghanistan's score missing, and Argentina's GDP missing for 2012. We'll go ahead and delete these 2 countries for our example. So if you are using the 2x2 score, where it says democracy yes, no, and state income high and low, all you have to do is to say which ones are democracies. The polity 2 score of 6 and above are usually considered a democracy. Anything that's 5 and below are considered non-democracies. So what we can do is we can create a new variable, democracy, and create a condition. What we have done here is we told the Excel spreadsheet to code each country, and if the polity 2 score is equal to or greater than 6, the variable democracy will now read 1. If it is not, the variable democracy will now read 0. What's really interesting about this is we have the GDP score or GDP value here. And we have to decide what is high or what is low. Usually this is a very arbitrary number. So for the sake of simplicity, what we can say is, say anywhere around $20,000 per capita is a high number. So we create a different variable, GDP high and low, and do the exact same thing. So what we have then is a list of states that have either democracy yes or no and GDP high or low. So what we can do is we can now fill in the boxes. I'm going to show you how to do this here. So democracy yes, and income high, yes, income low, no. So what we have here is that we have Australia, Austria with yes and high, ones in both sides. We have Albania, that is yes and low. We have Bahrain, that's no and high. And we have everybody else, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that is no and low. So as you can see, we have basically filled in the upper left-hand corner with 2 states and lower right-hand corner with 5 states, and the other 2 boxes have 1 each. So this particular small sample leads us to believe that our hypothesis may be correct. And you can do this a little bit more granularity if you want to do it as democracy, anocracy, or autocracy. So you can say, let's create a variable called regime. And this one is going to say, if the Poly2 score is greater than or equal to 6, then it is a democracy. If not, is less than 6, and it is greater or equal to -5, then it is an anocracy. If not, then it's a autocracy. As you can see, Albania registers as a 2, which is what we have coded as a democracy. And we drag this all the way down. Then you'll see all the different categories of the states. And instead of having democracy, yes or no, now we have democracy, anocracy, and autocracy. So it will end up with something like this. And democracy and high is 2 and 1. 2 in the regime and 1 in the GDP high and low, so we still have 2. Democracy and low, we have 1. Anocracy and high, which is regime is 1 and GDP has to be 1 as well, we have 0. Anocracy and low, we have 4. Autocracy and high, we have 1. And autocracy and low, we have 1. So as you can see, we still have 6 regime or 6 states that are either not democracies with high and low GDP as it was before, and we have 2 states that are democracies, 2 with high income and 1 with low income. So either way, what this shows you is your hypothesis that we have proposed, that a state will have higher income if a state is a democracy, are positively correlated with each other.
Today we have gone over the qualitative and quantitative methods you will need to know to successfully negotiate your research paper assignment. The full requirement for the methodology section of this paper is listed on pages 11 and 12 of your syllabus for your reference. As always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to bring up your questions to your instructor, either in class or individually.